celebrate the development, while others are accusing the U.S.
In the early hours before dawn, something happened in international waters that official briefings still refuse to explain. Radar operators aboard the U.S. Navy's most advanced warship suddenly detected fast-moving contacts rising from the horizon, closing the distance far too quickly to ignore. Within minutes, alarms echoed across the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan, and dozens of sailors realized they were no longer running an exercise. This was real. According to leaked reports and eyewitness accounts, the contacts were identified as Venezuelan SU-30 fighter jets, flying low and fast, using the sea itself as cover. No warning shots, no radio contact, just a direct approach toward one of the most heavily protected symbols of American military power. For years, analysts claimed such a scenario was unthinkable. That morning, it allegedly happened. As the aircraft closed in, the carrier strike group shifted instantly into combat posture. Defensive systems powered up. Fighter crews sprinted toward their jets. Yet what stunned commanders was the confidence of the approaching planes. They did not retreat. They did not break formation. Instead, they began aggressive attack runs, simulating missile locks and passing dangerously close to escort ships. Sources claim the pilots knew exactly how far they could push without triggering an immediate counterstrike. What followed was a tense sequence lasting only minutes, but with consequences that could have reshaped global politics. The Venezuelan jets reportedly executed coordinated maneuvers that mimicked a real strike profile, forcing U.S. systems to track multiple threats simultaneously. At one point, an internal alert allegedly classified the situation as a credible attack scenario. For a brief window of time, the world may have been seconds away from open conflict between Venezuela and the SS Chivi. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the jets turned away. No missiles were launched, no shots were fired. Silence returned to the radar screens, but the damage was already done. The message had been delivered. Military experts later suggested this was not an accident or a rogue patrol, but a calculated demonstration designed to test American reaction time, expose defensive patterns, and prove a political point without crossing the final red line. Official statements downplayed the incident, calling it routine activity or an unconfirmed encounter. Yet internal sources claim emergency meetings followed within hours, and allied governments were quietly briefed. Why would Venezuelan pilots risk such a move? How close did the carrier really come to authorizing defensive fire? And why has so much of what allegedly happened never been fully acknowledged? What the public was told is only part of the story. What actually happened in those minutes over open water may redefine how modern power is challenged, not with explosions, but with precision, nerve, and just enough restraint to leave the entire world asking one question: what happens next? Before sunrise, when the ocean was still dark and calm, the routine aboard the USS Ronald Reagan followed a familiar pattern. Night watch teams monitored radar screens, communications officers logged standard maritime traffic, and most of the crew treated the shift as uneventful. The carrier was operating in international waters as part of a scheduled deployment, accompanied by escort ships and airborne early warning aircraft. Nothing in the official plan suggested that the next few minutes would break that routine. And yet, it was precisely this sense of normality that made the first warning signs so unsettling. Shortly after 4:30 local time, radar operators detected several fast-moving contacts at extreme range, initially indistinguishable from civilian aircraft or distant patrol flights. Such detections were not unusual in heavily trafficked regions, and standard protocol required observation rather than immediate escalation. However, within moments, analysts noticed something unusual. The contacts were descending rapidly and accelerating, flying a profile more consistent with military jets than with commercial planes. Their altitude dropped to a level that allowed them to blend into surface clutter, a known tactic used to reduce radar visibility. At this stage, the situation was still classified internally as anomalous, not hostile. As the objects closed the distance, automated systems began refining their tracks, and identification algorithms narrowed the possibilities. According to later internal briefings, the flight characteristics matched those of SU-30 multi-role fighters, an aircraft known to be operated by the Venezuelan Air Force. This identification alone did not imply an attack, but it raised immediate concern. The appearance of foreign military aircraft approaching a U.S. carrier group without prior coordination or radio contact crossed a critical threshold. Communication officers attempted standard hailing procedures on international distress and military frequencies. No response came back. What made the situation more alarming was the speed of the approach. The aircraft were no longer drifting toward the carrier group, they were heading directly toward it. Within minutes, the estimated time to closest point of approach dropped below 10 minutes, triggering internal alerts across the ship. Sailors later described a subtle but noticeable shift in atmosphere. Voices lowered, movements became faster, and the bridge filled with additional officers. While no general alarm was sounded, key systems were quietly brought out of standby mode. According to semi-official accounts, airborne radar from an accompanying E-2 Hawkeye aircraft confirmed the contacts and provided clearer tracking data. The fighters were flying in a loose but coordinated formation, suggesting trained pilots operating under deliberate command rather than an accidental navigation error. One detail that has never been publicly confirmed, but is often mentioned in leaked discussions, is that the jets briefly adjusted their heading to align directly with the carrier's projected course, a maneuver interpreted by some analysts as a deliberate signal rather than coincidence. At this early stage, no weapons had been detected on targeting systems, and no aggressive actions had yet occurred. Still, the absence of communication combined with the flight profile forced commanders to consider worst-case scenarios. The situation remained just ambiguous enough to prevent immediate defensive action, but far too serious to ignore. This delicate balance between uncertainty and threat is what made the opening moments of the incident so dangerous. By the time the contacts crossed a predefined security boundary around the carrier group, the event was no longer viewed as routine. Internal logs reportedly shifted classification from unknown contact to potential hostile approach. It was the moment when an otherwise quiet night turned into something else entirely, setting the stage for a confrontation that, whether intentional or not, would echo far beyond the open water where it began. As the distance continued to shrink, the encounter entered a far more dangerous phase defined not by weapons, but by proximity. The Venezuelan SU-30 fighters descended even lower, skimming just above the ocean surface before climbing sharply in a maneuver that forced U.S. tracking systems to constantly recalibrate. This was no random flight path. Experienced observers aboard the USS Ronald Reagan immediately recognized the pattern as a deliberate attempt to test reaction thresholds. Such maneuvers are widely taught in modern air combat training and are designed to apply pressure without crossing the clear line of attack. As the jets closed to visual range, their behavior became increasingly assertive. According to accounts later shared among naval personnel, the fighters split into pairs, with one element maintaining a steady approach while the other performed wide, arcing turns around the carrier group's perimeter. This forced escort ships and airborne controllers to divide their attention, a classic demonstration tactic meant to simulate the early stages of a coordinated strike. Although no weapons were fired, the choreography itself carried an unmistakable message. On the carrier's deck, flight operations were temporarily halted. Aircraft that had been preparing for routine patrols were held in place as commanders evaluated whether to escalate. Below deck, Combat Information Center teams tracked every movement in near silence, watching digital icons representing the jets glide closer with unnerving precision. At least one of the fighters reportedly dropped to an altitude so low that it briefly disappeared from certain radar angles, reappearing moments later at a closer range. While such tactics are well documented in military aviation, their use against an active carrier group during peacetime was highly unusual. Perhaps the most striking moment came when one of the SU-30s passed within a few nautical miles of an escort destroyer, banking sharply so that its silhouette was clearly visible to observers. Sailors on deck later claimed they could see the aircraft's markings as it roared past, close enough to leave no doubt that the pilots wanted to be seen. This was not a reconnaissance flyby conducted at a safe distance. It was a calculated show of confidence and nerve. Throughout this phase, repeated attempts were made to establish radio contact. Standard challenge and response protocols were broadcast on multiple frequencies, including internationally recognized emergency channels. Again, no reply was received. Whether this silence was intentional or the result of standing orders remains unclear, but its effect was unmistakable. Every unanswered call increased the perception that the encounter was spiraling towards something more serious. At the same time, U.S. defensive measures remained carefully restrained. Fire control radars reportedly tracked the aircraft intermittently, but avoided sustained locks that could be interpreted as a prelude to engagement. This restraint, while intentional, added to the tension. Both sides appeared to be operating at the very edge of escalation, fully aware that a single miscalculation, an abrupt turn, a sensor glitch, a misunderstood signal, could trigger irreversible consequences. Some later analyses suggested that the Venezuelan pilots were timing their maneuvers to coincide with known radar sweep intervals, subtly probing for gaps in coverage. While such precision would require extensive planning and intelligence, it would not be unprecedented for advanced air forces. Whether this level of sophistication was truly present or merely perceived under stress is still debated. But the impression it left on those monitoring the encounter was powerful. By the end of this phase, the encounter had transformed from a distant anomaly into a close-range standoff defined by speed, altitude, and intent rather than open fire. The jets had not attacked, yet they had pushed the situation to its limits, demonstrating just how thin the line can be between routine operations and potential conflict. The airspace around the carrier had become a silent battleground of maneuver and perception, where every second mattered and every movement was loaded with meaning. What had begun as aggressive maneuvering now crossed into a far more dangerous psychological and operational zone. After the close approaches described earlier, internal threat assessments shifted rapidly. Sensors aboard the USS Ronald Reagan began registering intermittent targeting cues from the approaching aircraft. Signals that did not confirm an actual weapons lock, but strongly suggested simulated attack runs. To experienced combat officers, this distinction mattered less than the intent behind it. The Venezuelan pilots were no longer simply demonstrating presence. They were rehearsing an attack profile in real time, using a live carrier strike group as the reference point. According to later reconstructed timelines, the fighters executed a coordinated sequence designed to overwhelm defensive awareness. One aircraft accelerated sharply and climbed, while another dropped back and altered its vector, creating conflicting threat geometries for tracking systems. This forced U.S. operators to treat the situation as more than a single-axis problem. Such tactics are taught in advanced air combat doctrine and are meant to expose how quickly a defended target can be saturated, even without launching weapons. While no missiles were detected, the implied scenario was unmistakable. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from controlled tension to acute focus. Authorization was quietly granted to prepare defensive countermeasures, including electronic warfare systems and short-range air defenses, though commanders stopped short of issuing an engagement order. Fighter aircraft were brought to immediate readiness, pilots strapped in and awaiting launch clearance. The decision not to launch immediately reflected a calculated effort to avoid being seen as the party that escalated the situation first. Still, every second of delay carried risk. The most critical moment came when one of the SU-30 aligned itself on a vector consistent with a simulated missile release envelope. For a brief interval, tracking software flagged the maneuver as indistinguishable from a real attack, until further sensor correlation downgraded the threat. That window, measured in seconds, was reportedly enough to prompt internal debate over whether defensive fire would be justified under existing rules of engagement. Those rules, designed for clarity, suddenly felt dangerously narrow in a scenario built on ambiguity. As tension peaked, the carrier strike group responded in ways that were visible without being overtly hostile. Escort ships adjusted formation, subtly tightening the defensive screen. Electronic emissions shifted, indicating that countermeasure systems were fully active. From the air, an E-2 Hawkeye maintained constant surveillance, feeding commanders a clearer picture of the unfolding geometry. The message to the approaching aircraft was carefully calibrated. They were being tracked, understood, and could be engaged instantly if they crossed a final threshold. What made this phase especially volatile was the apparent awareness on both sides of exactly where that threshold lay. The Venezuelan pilots continued to push just short of it, executing one final high-speed pass that analysts later described as deliberately provocative but legally deniable. This maneuver, more than any other, crystallized the risk. A sudden mechanical failure, a misinterpreted radar return, or a nervous reaction from a single operator could have transformed the standoff into an exchange of fire. For several long moments, the situation hovered at that edge. No alarms sounded publicly, no weapons were released, yet the carrier remained seconds away from authorizing defensive action. Crew members later recalled the uncanny quiet of those minutes, broken only by clipped radio exchanges and the hum of equipment pushed to maximum alert. It was the kind of silence that exists only when everyone involved understands the stakes perfectly. Then, without warning, the dynamic shifted. The Venezuelan aircraft broke their attack profiles almost simultaneously, increasing distance and altering course away from the carrier group. There was no triumphant radio call, no final gesture. They simply disengaged. From a tactical perspective, the withdrawal appeared disciplined rather than hurried, suggesting that the objective had already been achieved. The demonstration was complete. Even as the jets pulled away, the carrier group remained on heightened alert, wary of a possible second wave or a delayed escalation. Only after the contacts moved well beyond a defined exclusion zone did commanders begin to ease defensive postures. The immediate danger had passed, but its psychological impact lingered. The encounter had revealed how quickly controlled signaling could evolve into near combat, even without a single shot fired. In the hours that followed, internal debriefings focused on one central question: how close had the situation truly come to open conflict between Venezuela and the Secestan contract? Officially, the answer would later be softened, framed as an unprofessional but non-hostile interaction. Privately, many involved described it as one of the most dangerous gray zone encounters they had ever witnessed. The true significance of those moments lay not in what happened, but in what almost did. The simulated attack, the restrained response, and the razor-thin margin for error together formed a case study in modern power projection, where intimidation and perception can be as decisive as firepower. For those on board, the memory of that critical point, when restraint held and escalation did not, remained long after the radar screens returned to normal, a reminder of how fragile stability can be when tested at high speed and low altitude. In the aftermath of the encounter, what lingered most was not the memory of specific maneuvers or alerts, but the unsettling absence of closure. As noted earlier, the immediate danger had passed, yet the silence that followed felt deliberate rather than accidental. On board the USS Ronald Reagan, commanders chose restraint in their public posture, issuing only minimal internal guidance and instructing crews to avoid speculation. Official logs were finalized with carefully neutral language, describing the event as an unresolved aerial interaction, a phrase that revealed little while implying far more than it explained. Within hours, the carrier strike group resumed standard operations, but the atmosphere had changed. Informal conversations among sailors reflected a shared understanding that something extraordinary had occurred, even if it would never be fully acknowledged. Several crew members later recalled briefings that emphasized professionalism and composure, while quietly reinforcing that the incident would be reviewed at the highest levels. The message was clear. This was not just another close encounter, but neither was it something the public would hear about in detail. Beyond the ship itself, diplomatic and military channels reportedly became active. While no formal protest was announced, analysts believe that discreet communications took place between Washington and Caracas. The lack of public escalation suggested that both sides saw value in ambiguity. For CCA, acknowledging how close the situation came to confrontation risked signaling vulnerability or loss of control. For Venezuela, denying intent while allowing the episode to circulate through unofficial channels may have served as a quiet demonstration of reach and confidence. In the days that followed, fragments of the story began appearing in defense circles and online forums, often exaggerated, sometimes distorted, and rarely complete. Anonymous sources hinted at internal investigations and classified assessments, while commentators debated whether the encounter represented a new phase of gray zone confrontation at sea. The absence of confirmed details only fueled speculation. Some claimed the incident was a calculated rehearsal. Others suggested it was a bold political message, timed to coincide with unrelated diplomatic pressures. None of these narratives could be fully proven, yet all drew credibility from the fact that no one in authority outright denied that something unusual had happened. What made the conclusion of the incident so effective was precisely this uncertainty. No wreckage, no casualties, no dramatic footage, just unanswered questions. Military historians often note that the most influential confrontations are not always the loudest ones, but those that quietly redefine boundaries. In this case, the final withdrawal of the aircraft, mentioned earlier, became the closing punctuation mark of a sentence deliberately left incomplete. Even months later, the encounter continued to surface in training discussions and strategic planning scenarios, cited as an example of how quickly routine operations can transform into high-stakes signaling. The lack of a definitive ending ensured that the incident lived on not as a resolved event, but as a warning. It suggested that future confrontations might follow the same pattern: intense, ambiguous, and stopping just short of open conflict. In the end, the most powerful outcome was not what happened in the sky that morning, but what did not happen. No missiles were launched, no orders crossed the point of no return. Yet the message remained unmistakable. The question left behind, quietly, deliberately, was not who won or lost, but how many similar encounters could occur before restraint finally fails.